Let's go to China. Yeah, I mean, huge story, really huge story come out of China. There's been all of these swings in the trade war. So, for example, you guys covered with Emily, Trump announces a 100% tariff on China in retaliation for rare earth minerals being cut off. The Chinese are holding incredibly firm, and the administration is now taking a very different tone, saying, actually, we are in a sustained trade war now with China. Let's take a listen to Trump yesterday in the Oval Office.
You're meeting with President Xi in a few weeks.
Yeah.
If you can't come to an agreement or a deal at that meeting, are we in for a sustained trade war with China?
Well, you're in one now. Look, we have 100% tariff. If we didn't have tariffs, we would be exposed as being a nothing. We would have no defense.
We're in one now, so he's declaring the trade war. This actually needs to pair with these comments from Secretary Scott Bessent, who is ripping the Chinese negotiators, taking a very, very hard line, despite some of the things going on behind the scenes we'll tell you about in a bit. But let's take a listen to that first.
What happened from your point of view? Because I thought talks were going well, lines of communication were open, and then we learned about this rare earth mineral restriction from China, and now it's back and forth and things are heating up again.
They are, and the Chinese are trying to backfill the narrative, saying, well, the U.S. did A, B, and C, therefore we had to do D, and that's not true. There was a lower-level trade person who was slightly unhinged here in August. I think his name is Li Guangdong, and threatening, saying that China would unleash chaos on the global system if the U.S. went ahead with our docking fees for Chinese ships. And this is clearly something that they were planning all along. I think that things can de-escalate, that we don't want to have to escalate. We have things that are more powerful than the rare earth export controls that the Chinese want to put on. And sir, to be clear, this is China versus the world. It's not a U.S.-China problem. Good news is that this is IMF week. A lot of my counterpart, or all my counterparts are here. We're going to be speaking with our European allies, with Australia, with Canada, with India, and the Asian democracies. And we're going to have a fulsome group response to this, because bureaucrats in China cannot manage the supply chain or the manufacturing process.
Okay, so this is absolutely brutal for Trump. China just delivered a massive economic blow that sent global markets into a tailspin and exposed a major weakness in Trump's entire trade war strategy. And honestly, it was pretty genius on China's part. Here's what happened. On October 9th, 2025, China issued what's being called announcement number 61 inches, which sounds boring until you understand what it actually does. They're tightening export controls on rare earth minerals. And not just any rare earth minerals. They're enforcing strict licensing requirements for any goods containing just 0.1% or more of these materials. Now, if you don't know about rare earths, let me explain why this is such a big deal. These minerals are absolutely critical for modern technology. We're talking about components in smartphones, electric vehicles, military equipment, defense systems, medical devices, basically everything that makes the modern economy work. And China controls the vast majority of global rare earth production and processing. So when China says we're restricting exports of these materials, that's not just a trade policy tweak. That's an economic weapon. That's China saying, you want to play hardball with tariffs? We control supply chains you literally can't function without. And the markets, they absolutely panicked. The Dow Jones fell 878 points. The S&P 500 dropped 2.7%. The Nasdaq lost 3.56%. We're talking about over $1.5 trillion in market value wiped out within days of this announcement. $1.5 trillion gone. Because China tightened export controls on minerals that most people have never even heard of. That's how much power China has over global supply chains. Trump's response was, well, it was Trump. He called China very hostile and accused them of holding the world captive. Which, I mean, he's not entirely wrong about China using their dominant position for leverage. But here's the problem. Trump has been threatening China with massive tariffs for months. He threatened 100% tariffs on Chinese imports. And China just called his bluff in the most devastating way possible. Because what good are tariffs if China can just restrict the raw materials that American companies need to manufacture products in the first place? You can't manufacture defense technology without rare earths. You can't build advanced electronics without them. So China basically said, go ahead, impose your tariffs. We'll just cut off your access to critical materials and watch your entire tech and defense sectors struggle. And here's the kicker. After the markets crashed and the economic fallout became clear, Trump suddenly changed his tune. He started saying that his 100% tariff plan might be not sustainable. Not sustainable. That's a pretty dramatic walk back from the tough guy rhetoric he'd been using for months. All right, so let's talk about the strategic disaster this represents for Trump's entire approach to China. Because this exposes some fundamental weaknesses in his trade war strategy. Trump's whole playbook has been, America has leverage because we're a huge market for Chinese goods. If we threaten tariffs, China will have to back down because they need access to American consumers. And for some products, that's true. China does export a lot to the United States, and tariffs do hurt their economy. But China just demonstrated that they have leverage too. Maybe even more leverage in certain critical areas. Because while the US is a big market, China controls supply chains for essential materials. And when you control the inputs that other countries need for manufacturing and defense, you have enormous power. This is what people mean when they talk about strategic dependencies. The United States has become dependent on China for rare earth minerals because China invested heavily in production and processing, while the US let its domestic rare earth industry decline. And now we're paying the price for that strategic mistake. Trump called China's move holding the world captive. But whose fault is it that America became so dependent on Chinese rare earths in the first place? This didn't happen overnight. This was decades of U.S. companies choosing to offshore production, decades of not investing in domestic rare earth capabilities, decades of prioritizing short-term profits over long-term strategic security. And now, Trump is discovering that you can't just bully China into submission with tariff threats when they control critical supply chains. They have cards to play too, and they just played a major one. China's Commerce Ministry came out and accused the U.S. of undermining trade talks with continual tariff threats and warned of countermeasures if escalation continues. And that's not an empty threat anymore. They just showed they're willing to use their rare earth dominance as a weapon. Trump's mixed messaging is telling. First, he's threatening 100% tariffs, then the markets crash. Then he's saying those tariffs might not be sustainable. That's not strength. That's someone who realized they miscalculated and is trying to back down without admitting they were wrong. And here's the political problem for Trump. His entire brand is built on being tough on China. He campaigned on making China pay. He's been telling his supporters for years that he's the only one who can stand up to Beijing. But now, China just humiliated him economically and forced him to walk back his threats. That's not a good look. Okay, so let's zoom out and talk about what this means for the global economy and the future of US-China relations. Because this isn't just about one market crash or one trade dispute. This is about fundamental power dynamics in the 21st century economy. The rare earth situation exposes how fragile global supply chains really are. We've built this incredibly complex, interconnected economic system where products get assembled from components made in dozens of different countries. And that system works great until it doesn't. Until one country decides to use their control over a critical input as leverage. This is why there's been so much talk about reshoring and friendshoring and rebuilding domestic manufacturing capacity. Because dependence on potential adversaries for critical materials is a national security vulnerability. But here's the problem. Rebuilding those capabilities takes years and billions of dollars in investment. You can't just snap your fingers and create a domestic rare earth industry. You need mines, you need processing facilities, you need skilled workers, you need environmental regulations that allow for extraction and processing. You need years of development time. So even if Trump wanted to make America independent of Chinese rare earths, it's not something that can happen quickly. Meanwhile, China has been planning this for decades. They've been investing in rare earth production not just in China, but in other countries too. They've been buying up mines in Africa and South America. They've been building processing capabilities that no other country can match. This isn't improvisation. This is long-term strategic planning. And now they're reaping the benefits. When Trump threatens them, they can respond by restricting access to materials that the U.S. economy literally cannot function without. That's real power. That's the kind of leverage that makes tariff threats look weak by comparison. The market crash is significant because it shows that investors understand the stakes. When $1.5 trillion in value evaporates because of an export restriction announcement, that tells you the markets believe this is serious. They believe China will follow through, and they believe it will hurt. The tech sector is particularly vulnerable. Everything from smartphones to laptops to advanced AI chips requires rare earth elements. If China restricts exports, American tech companies either have to pay much higher prices for whatever materials they can get, or they have to redesign products to use alternative materials, which takes time and money and might result in inferior products. The defense sector is even more concerning from a national security perspective. Advanced weapon systems, guidance systems, radar, communications equipment, all of it requires rare earths. If China can threaten U.S. military capabilities by restricting rare earth exports, that's a massive strategic problem. Trump's admission that 100% tariffs might not be sustainable is essentially an admission that his strategy didn't work. He thought he could pressure China through tariffs. China called his bluff and showed they have countermeasures that are just as painful, maybe more painful than anything Trump can threaten. The WTO chief has been urging the U.S. and China to de-escalate before this turns into a prolonged trade war that damages the entire global economy. And honestly, that's probably the right call. Because if this keeps escalating, if Trump tries to retaliate and China responds with more restrictions, everybody loses. But de-escalation requires both sides to back down. And neither Trump nor Xi Jinping want to look weak. So we might be heading into a prolonged economic conflict that neither side can really win, but both sides are too proud to end. For American consumers and businesses, this is bad news. Market crashes hurt retirement accounts and investment portfolios. Trade wars increase costs and create uncertainty. Supply chain disruptions make it harder to get products and components. None of this is good for the economy. And politically, this undermines Trump's entire message about being tough on China and winning trade wars. When China can force you to walk back your tariff threats just by restricting rare earth exports, you're not winning, you're getting played. The long-term question is whether this finally motivates the U.S. to invest seriously in reducing dependence on Chinese rare earths. Will we rebuild domestic production? Will we secure alternative sources? Will we invest in research to find substitutes for rare earth materials? Because if we don't, we're going to keep being vulnerable to this kind of economic coercion. But all of that takes political will and sustained investment over many years. And it's not clear that our political system is capable of that kind of long-term strategic thinking. We tend to focus on short-term wins and immediate problems rather than decade-long projects to rebuild industrial capacity. So for now, China has the upper hand. They demonstrated they can hurt the U.S. economy just as much as U.S. tariffs hurt them. Maybe more. And Trump is learning the hard way that economic warfare is more complicated than just threatening the biggest tariffs and expecting the other side to cave. Retry.